Something is wrong here. You would think this would be easy to answer. If something was believed to measure one thing, then that should be clear. It should stay clear. You should be able to point to it, name it, and move on. That is what we expect. A measure is supposed to feel solid. It is supposed to tell you what it is measuring and keep telling you the same thing. But then something starts to feel off. Not all at once. Just enough to make that simple expectation stop sitting right. The name still sounds familiar. The purpose still sounds settled. And yet it does not stay as clean as it should. You look at it again, and it feels less fixed than it did a moment ago. Like everyone agreed on what it meant. Until you listen a little longer. And then you start wondering how something could be treated as a measure at all if what it was believed to measure does not stay where you expect it to. So what was it believed to measure? At first glance, the question seemed already answered by the room itself. The frame stood in a burial chamber, cut from stone, with a jackal-headed figure carved above the beam. Two shallow pans still hung from it, nearly level despite corrosion in the fittings. On the wall beside it, a painted scene repeated the familiar image. A heart in one pan, a feather in the other. Black resin stains ran down the base stones and pooled in old seams in the floor. If an object is found in a tomb, beneath Anubis, beside a weighing scene with embalming residue around its feet, what else would it be measuring, except the heart of the dead against truth? That reading held together unusually well. The iconography matched the placement. The residue matched the funerary setting. Even the symmetry of the pans seemed less practical than ceremonial, as though balance mattered more than quantity. The device looked less like equipment than a fixed version of a known judgment image. It seemed possible that the chamber had been arranged to materialize a passage from painted doctrine into stone procedure. But the first measurements introduced a quieter problem. Along the central arm, almost lost under dust and mineral film, ran a sequence of fine graduated marks. They were not decorative cuts. They were regular, closely spaced, and extended farther than a symbolic beam would require. A judgment scene on a wall does not need calibration. A funerary emblem does not need repeated intervals precise enough to compare small differences in load. If the scale was only a representation of divine weighing, why mark the arm for reading? The chamber offered another interruption. Beneath one side of the frame, the paving was worn lower than the surrounding floor. Not broken by collapse, not cracked by settlement. Worn. The hollowing was localized, as if pressure or repeated stance had concentrated there over time. Yet the object was assumed to belong to the dead, and the dead do not return often enough to grind stone under one side of the scale. Still, the funerary explanation did not disappear. The wall painting remained where it was. The jackal figure remained above the beam. The resin traces still tied the installation to burial practice. A calibrated instrument could still belong to ritual. Priests might have used it in reenactments of judgment, repeating before the coffin what the painted wall promised beyond death. In that setting, the marks would matter. The pans would matter. The wear on the floor might come from officiants standing in one place during repeated ceremonies. That seemed to gather the evidence back into one workable arrangement. Then the resin itself complicated the chamber. The black streaks around the base were not distributed evenly, as runoff from general embalming work might be. They clustered nearer one side. And if the scale had been fixed for a single tomb ceremony, why preserve a beam with readable graduations at all? Why maintain balance pans capable of repeated use? Why does the floor under one side look less like a single installation point than a station? So the question narrowed instead of closing. The device was certainly linked to judgment imagery. It was certainly used where burial substances were present. But whether it measured a heart, a substitute, an offering, or something else entirely remained unsettled. The wall said one thing. The arm said another. The floor had begun to say a third. At first glance, the question seemed already answered by the room itself. The scale stood in a temple storeroom, not in a sealed burial chamber. Its beam reassembled and its two pans hanging evenly beneath it. Along the central arm, fine graduated marks ran in close intervals, too deliberate to be decorative. The beam also carried a second kind of record. The grip points were worn smooth and glossy where the surrounding metal remained rough. Whatever had once been weighed here, the instrument had been lifted, steadied, adjusted, and used often enough for hands to leave a surface history of repetition. That made the old funerary reading feel less secure. A device made only to symbolize judgment in painted tomb scenes would not need such careful calibration. The marks suggested measured comparison, not mere display. The polished handhold suggested repeated performance. In that setting, the paired pans began to look less like a static emblem of the dead before Anubis, and more like a working ritual instrument. Something priests could have used to reenact judgment ceremonies before an audience or initiate. The beam did not simply represent balance. It had been balanced. The replacement pin sharpened that impression. One hinge held a bronze pin of different color and finish from the rest of the frame, clearly inserted later. Repair implies value, but a particular kind of value. Not the reverence reserved for an untouchable relic, rather the need to keep an apparatus functioning. If the scale had broken and been mended in a later period, then someone still required it to operate. A ceremonial reenactment fits that sequence neatly. A priestly rite, repeated over generations, would explain the worn grips, the calibrated arm, the restored hinge, the continued preservation of the paired pans. For a while, that arrangement accounted for nearly everything visible on the object itself. The scale could have measured symbolic equivalence during a staged judgment, perhaps a token heart against a token feather, perhaps offerings assigned ritual values according to the marks. The central arm invited reading. The handholds invited use. The later pin invited continuity. But the storeroom inventory notes complicated the neatness of that picture. The restored beam had not originally been cataloged there. Earlier field sketches placed the frame elsewhere before consolidation, and one notation, almost incidental, mentioned abrasion on paving stones beneath one side of the base. Not damage to the scale, damage to the floor under it. The wear was localized and deeper than the surrounding surface, as if one side had borne repeated pressure in a fixed position over a long period. A portable ritual prop should distribute its history differently. Why would the pavement remember one side more than the instrument remembered movement? And there was another silence in the current explanation. The famous wall scenes of heart weighing, so persuasive at first, had become oddly unnecessary once the marks and handholds took over the argument. If the scale was understood through use, why did the imagery cling so tightly to it in every early description? Were the scenes evidence of function? Or had they simply supplied the first available label? The beam still offered its measured intervals. The grips still shone where fingers had passed. The later pin still held the hinge together. Yet the question of what it was believed to measure had narrowed, rather than settled. If priests used it repeatedly, they were not preserving an image alone. They were measuring something often enough to wear the metal smooth, and in one place, long enough to wear the floor. At first the question seemed narrower than it was. If the scale was not merely symbolic, then what had actually rested in its pans? The chamber offered a practical answer before any inscription did. A dark resin crust clung to the inside of one pan, not as a stain from passing contact, but as a built layer, thickest near the curve where material would settle if repeatedly poured or pressed there. Along the rim, linen fibers were fused into black pitch, caught in the hardened surface as though strips or wrappings had brushed against it while the substance was still tacky. In the hinge seam, white natron crystals remained packed so tightly that they looked less like later contamination than trapped working residues. That combination made the first useful picture. Resin, linen, natron, embalming materials, or offerings prepared from the same stock. The polished handholds on the frame helped that reading. Bright patches stood out against the darker surface, exactly where fingers would steady the beam during repeated use. Not a ceremonial object left untouched in a tomb, then, but something handled often enough to wear through its own finish. A weighing device for measured portions under the protection of Anubis fit the evidence cleanly. The jackal image above the beam no longer needed to identify the act as judgment. It could simply mark divine oversight of substances used in burial work. For a while, that explanation held, because the residues agreed with one another. Natron belonged near preserved bodies. Resin belonged in sealing and coating. Linen belonged in wrapping. Even the asymmetry of the deposit seemed useful. One pan had done the dirty work, the other perhaps held weights or cleaner materials. The scale could have regulated mixtures, portions, or stages of preparation. If a workshop had to standardize what entered a chamber, this was the sort of instrument it would leave behind. Then the residue was mapped more closely. The resin crust sat inside one pan, but the linen fibers were not distributed through A. They were fused only along the rim, as if contact had happened at the edge rather than in the body of the material. The natron crystals, meanwhile, were not scattered across the frame or embedded in the pan where loose measuring would have dropped them. They were packed into a narrow hinge seam, a place reached by dust and seepage over time, but awkward for routine loading. If natron had been weighed here in quantity, why did it survive in the joint and not across the working surfaces? The polished grip points raised a second problem. They were bright and localized, not broad wear from lifting and carrying, but repeated contact at fixed positions. That suggested careful balancing by hand, perhaps fine adjustment rather than rough measurement of bulk ingredients. Yet the visible residues belonged to sticky, granular, practical materials. Why would a device used for embalming compounds need such controlled handling? The pan with resin looked utilitarian until the deposits were compared with the wear. The frame had been steadied, often. The pan had held something adhesive. The rim had met linen. The hinge had trapped natron. Each detail supported use, but not quite the same use. Was the scale measuring ingredients, or was it receiving prepared packets, wrapped portions, or treated objects placed there one by one? If so, what exactly required weighing under such careful control? At first glance, the answer seemed straightforward enough to survive cataloging. The beam carried marks, the pans were paired, and one pan still held a dark smear that tested as resinous. In a workshop or embalming room, that would have been enough. A scale with residue in the pan measures materials. The only remaining task would be to decide which ones. But the marks along the arm complicated that simple use before it could settle. Under raking light, they did not read like broad divisions for handfuls or scoops. They crowded together so tightly that several disappeared, unless the beam was tilted just right. Bulk ingredients do not require that kind of discrimination. Natron, pitch, resin, oils, those are portioned in visible amounts in. A scale cut to such fine intervals suggests something much lighter, or something whose difference mattered at a much smaller threshold. That brought the nearby weights into focus. They were not rough pebbled masses or standard geometric pieces. They were tiny hearts, each carefully shaped, each small enough that several could rest in a palm without strain. Once they were set beside the beam, the calibration began to make more sense. A delicate scale, delicate weights, and a pan carrying resin traces. Perhaps not for measuring embalming stock in quantity, but for preparing minute ritual portions, drops, pellets, or compounds added in exact sequence. The gold leaf lining in one pan could even fit that idea. A protected surface would keep precious substances from reacting with the metal beneath. For a moment, that arrangement held. Fine marks for fine measures. Special pan for special material. Resin in the pan as the surviving remnant of repeated use. Then the gold leaf itself became awkward. It was too thin and too intact in the center, worn more at the edges than where a practical load would settle. The resin smear sat on top of the leaf rather than worked into it, as if contact had been brief or infrequent. And if the pan had been meant for repeated weighing of sticky compounds, why line only one side? A measuring instrument used for ingredients should preserve balance in both construction and wear. Here, one pan was ordinary and dark, the other bright and deliberately, almost singled out. The heart-shaped weights made the problem sharper, rather than clearer. Their masses were not random, but neither did they form a neat progression suited to ordinary apportioning. Two nearly identical hearts differed by less than the smallest visible interval on the beam. Another was heavier than its size suggested, packed with denser metal under a thin outer shell. That is not how one assembles a practical set for workshop use. It is how one assembles a set meant to look right, while behaving according to another rule. So what was being measured if not embalming material? The beam asks for something light. The weights insist on hearts. The gold-lined pan appears reserved, not merely protected. The resin remains, but only as a trace, not as a working accumulation. If the residue belongs to what was placed there, then the quantity was tiny. If it belongs only to contact from another setting, then the pan may have held something that left almost nothing behind at all. The scale still resembles an instrument of measure. The difficulty is that its precision points away from substance and towards significance, while the surviving smear keeps dragging the question back to matter. At first glance, the question seems settled by the objects laid out around the scale, rather than by the scale itself. On a linen-covered tray beside the frame, the counterweights were not simple pellets or stones but tiny hearts, each carefully shaped, each small enough to suggest substitution rather than load. The right pan, unlike the left, carried a thin lining of gold leaf. On the floor below, a broken inscription fragment preserved only 2 readable words. True of voice. A little farther out, half in dust, half against the base, several feather-shaped pendants lay together as if they had once belonged to a single set. That grouping made a neat explanation. If no actual heart was ever placed here, then something stood in for it. The heart weights could represent the burden being tested. The feather pendants could invoke the balancing standard. The phrase true of voice belonged exactly where a declaration of worth or purity would belong. The gold-lined pan, kept separate from the plain dark one, looked less like a work surface than a designated side in a formal comparison. Not a scale for matter then, but for condition. Not flesh, but symbolic equivalence. The arrangement held together even under closer recording. The heart-shaped weights were not all identical. They formed a graded set, increasing in tiny increments. That suggested procedure. A person, offering or token, could be balanced against a sequence of moral values, each one materially slight but conceptually exact. The gold leaf in one pan was too delicate for repeated coarse use, and remained largely intact, except for a dark smear near the center, as though whatever touched it had been small and carefully placed. The inscription fragment had broken from a larger text, but its surviving phrase was enough to anchor the right. One was declared true of voice only after some tests had been satisfied. Then the measurements began to press in from the edges. The feather-shaped pendants found near the base were not all alike either. 2 had suspension holes worn through from hanging. 3 had no wear at all, and differed slightly in thickness. If they were merely votive ornaments dropped nearby, why were they clustered at the scale, rather than dispersed through the room? If they were the balancing standard, why were they made as pendants instead of fixed weights? Their masses also varied more than the heart weights did. A standard that changes is not much of a standard. The gold-lined pan raised another difficulty. Gold leaf preserves contact patterns. Under magnification, the dark smear on its surface did not spread broadly as powder or resin would if repeatedly measured. It sat in a narrow crescent near one edge, with faint scoring beside it. Something had rested there off-center. Something small, hard-edged, and placed in the same position more than once. That awkward for a purely symbolic display, which would favor visibility and symmetry. The inscription fragment helped, but only to a point. True of voice can certify the dead, but it can also name the qualified, the vindicated, the admitted. The phrase does not say what was being weighed. The heart-shaped counterweights answer too quickly. They explain the iconography, the tray, the graded set. They do not explain why one pan was prepared like a receptacle and marked by repeated contact from a single object, and the feathers remain troublesome. If they were tokens of purity, why make several? If they were participants in the weighing, why do their masses drift while the heart weights stay disciplined? The scale begins to look less like a reenactment of judgment and more like a test built from its symbols, as though moral worth had to be made measurable by substitutes. But what, exactly, was placed in the gold-lined pan often enough to leave a crescent stain and fine scratches, yet lightly enough to require weights this small? At first, the question seemed narrower than it was. If this scale stood in an Anubis chapel rather than a burial chamber, what exactly had anyone expected it to weigh there? The base answered before the beam did. It stood directly beside the threshold, not against a wall, not in a storage recess, but where movement had to pass it. The paving under one side was worn into a shallow hollow, deeper than the surrounding stones and polished by repeated contact. That kind of wear belonged to traffic, to stopping and turning, to bodies gathering in one place long enough to grind the floor down. A funerary prop could be carried in for a ceremony. A threshold fixture had to be met. That made the nearby finds look less decorative. Feather-shaped pendants lay in a depression near the doorway, not one or two, but a small scatter, as if dropped, collected, and dropped again over time. If the scale had been used here repeatedly, and if feathers belonged to the right, then perhaps the weighing had not concerned embalming compounds at all. The object may have measured some token presented by the living before entry. A pendant, an amulet, a votive marker. Something light enough to suit the fine calibration already noted on the arm. For a while that arrangement held together cleanly. The threshold placement explained the floorware. The pendants explained why such a delicate scale would stand where people approached it. The chapel wall added another layer. Dedication lines had been erased and overwritten with later personal names, one after another. Not a single fixed donor then, but repeated individual association. Names accumulating beside a threshold scale suggested a sequence of persons submitting to the same act. If each name marked admission, vow, or purification, then the instrument may have measured ritual fitness rather than material quantity. But the wall did not behave like a register. The rewritten names were not arranged in orderly columns. Some cut across earlier lines. Some were inserted where space had been scraped open. That looked less like official recording than repeated reclaiming. If the scale certified entry, why was the evidence of that certification so unstable? And if pendants were the thing being weighed, why were they found scattered in the doorway depression, instead of stored with the instrument or placed in a shrine niche? The wear under the floor reopened the problem. It was concentrated beneath one side of the base, not centered where a priest would stand to operate the beam. The hollow suggested recurring pressure from a fixed position offset to the scale, as though those approaching paused at one side while the apparatus remained between them and the interior. That geometry made the body, not the offering, harder to ignore. The scale did not simply sit in the chapel. It interrupted passage into it. Then the rewritten names became more troublesome in a useful way. Personal names beside a threshold can mark donors, but they can also mark those who passed, those who sought access, those who returned. If the rite attached a name to a weighing, what was being tested? Not mass, in any practical sense, not bulk goods. Something represented by the feather pendants perhaps, but not reducible to them. The pendants may have stood in for a standard, a condition, a claim. So the scale begins to look less like an instrument for measuring substances and more like a checkpoint for measuring eligibility. Yet the floorware remains only on one side, as if the procedure favored a single stance or a single class of entrant, and the doorway still keeps its own silence. If this was for the living, why place Anubis's balance where every approach had to confront it, unless passing the threshold itself was the thing being weighed? At first the question seemed almost answered by where the device stood. The scale frame rose at the threshold of a ruined Anubis chapel, not buried in a sealed chamber, but fixed where a doorway opened behind it. That placement mattered more than the jackal carving ever had. A weighing device for the dead could be painted on a wall, invoked in a text, or set in a tomb as an image of judgment. This one occupied a passage. Anyone moving inward would have passed it at arm's length. The lower stones made that harder to ignore. Beneath one side of the base, the pavement was worn into a shallow hollow deeper than the surrounding floor, as if repeated standing or repeated setting down had favored the same position over a long period. Tomb equipment does not usually abrade thresholds this way. The chapel wall nearby carried dedication lines with names erased and written over by later names, suggesting continued use, repeated claim, repeated access. The scale belonged to a place people entered. That made the inscription fragment at the beam's base suddenly useful. True of voice was not a label for resin, or grain, or natron. It belonged to a condition, a status, something declared after testing. Set against the threshold, beside the beam, it read less like decoration than a verdict. The tiny heart-shaped counterweights and the cluster of feather-shaped pendants found near them seemed to complete the procedure. Not actual organs, not bulk materials, but substitutes. Heart against feather, worth against standard. A right for the living now fit the doorway. The rewritten names, the where underfoot. The scale measured ritual fitness before entry into protected space. Then the black resin returned. It stained the lower threshold stones and the feet of the scale in dark runs that matched traces from burial chambers elsewhere on the site. Not a clean temple floor then. Not a device reserved for initiates arriving, washed and named. The residue sat low, where drips and transfers accumulate over time, and it linked the threshold to funerary handling. If the rite belonged only to the living, why did the same material signature gather here that clung to embalming contexts? The heart weights and feather pendants still held their place in the picture, but the threshold no longer separated temple use from burial use. It joined them. The wording true of voice became less stable for that reason. Was it pronounced over a person entering the chapel, over a body being brought through, or over both under different circumstances? The location allowed either movement. The where beneath one side suggested repeated pauses at a fixed point, perhaps where attendants stopped before crossing. The resin traces suggested that some of those crossings involved prepared remains or materials from burial work, and the measure itself remains awkwardly out of reach. The scale was calibrated for something light, too light for ordinary embalming loads, yet the threshold stains insist on funerary contact. The pendants and miniature hearts imply symbolic weighing, but symbols usually do not leave floor hollows. If names were repeatedly rewritten on the wall, were individuals being admitted, commemorated, purified, or certified? The device may not have measured a substance at all. It may have measured eligibility in a form made physical, just long enough to register on the beam. But, if so, what exactly was placed in the gold-lined pan? And why does the doorway carry the residue of the dead as heavily as the language of the justified?